Excellent. Can you all see it? Yeah, excellent. So firstly, I'll start by introducing myself. So my name is Haisa and I'm Capacity Building Officer at ADEC. I have a bachelor degree with honors in psychology and I've been working as a mental health practitioner for many years now. So talking about mental health is very, very gratifying to me and it's something that I really enjoy doing. And I hope you'll get something out of this presentation. Now, something that I wanted to emphasize today is that mental health is a very broad topic. So because we only have, an hour allocated to this, it's not like I'll be covering every single thing in mental health. It's just an overview, but I do encourage you to have a look in your own time and to have a look at some resources because there's a lot to learn in that area and it's very, very interesting. At least I think it is. Just before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in Victoria and show my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Okay. Having technical problems. Oh, there we go. All right. So I thought we'd start with a bit of a world map about the share of population with mental health and substance use disorders, because I think there is a lot of myth surrounding where mental illness actually exists. So there's a lot of myth that, it's only found in developed countries, and that is not the reality at all. There is an issue of people not being diagnosed as much in other countries that don't have maybe as much knowledge of what mental illness is. But the reality is that mental illness is found in all countries across the world. So I just thought it would be interesting to show you this data. Now, why do we need to talk about mental health? Why is it important? Overall, there's a very poor recognition of mental ill health symptoms across different cultures. So what this means is that people don't really recognize that something they might be experienced might be a symptom of mental illness. And that is a problem because it results in low rates of help-seeking behaviors. So what that means is because people don't understand what they're going through, they don't seek support, they don't seek treatment for what they're experiencing. Something else is higher rates of stigma and discrimination, and I'll be talking a bit more about stigma and discrimination later in the presentation. Poor diagnosis. So as I mentioned before, if there is not a lot of understanding about symptoms of mental illness, about what mental illness is, then that leads to poor diagnosis. And the problem of poor diagnosis is that people don't really understand what's happening with them and they don't necessarily get the best treatment to help them with that. And then unhelpful treatment choices, which is very related to the poor diagnosis. So if people don't know what's happening, they don't really know how to address that. Now, I really want to spend some time on this slide and talk about the complex interaction of individual social and environmental factors that determine mental health. So what I mean by this is that mental health is never determined by one single thing. So it's never just because of someone's genetics or because of someone's, the way that someone thinks. Is never just that. It's always a complex interaction. So we have different factors. Within the individual factors, there are things like genetics, so our biology, the genes that we inherit, things like that, they can influence and they do influence whether we will have a good level of mental health or whether we can develop a mental illness. But there's also other factors in the individual level as well. So there's things like personality traits, whether someone is very open to new experiences or not, whether someone's neurotic, things like that influences their mental health outcome overall. Things like the beliefs that someone has in life, emotions, ability to manage emotions, resilience, So how well do they cope with stress? What are their strategies? Communication skills, physical health is a big one as well. Someone, who's going through a lot of physical health problems might be more vulnerable to developing mental illness. Cognitive biases, so those unhelpful automatic thoughts that we have, all of that is going to influence the overall outcome of what our mental health is going to look like. But then there's also the social side of it, which is things like loneliness versus social support. So we know that people who are very well supported by friends and family and loved ones in their life, they're more protected against mental illness. How they grow up, so the experiences that they have growing up, whether they are raised by neglectful parents versus good parenting. So again, none of that by itself determines someone's mental health. Is the interaction, is the combination of various factors that is going to determine whether someone is going to develop a mental illness or not. Things like trauma, exposure to violence and abuse versus being in a safe relationship, all of that will influence the mental health as well. And the last one is environmental factors. So as a society as well, the way that we live will influence whether our mental health is going to be good or not. So things like discrimination, which again, we'll be talking a bit more about, exposure toward disaster, whether someone has access to basic services, whether someone has access to mental health services, and then discrimination in general, so things like gender and racial equity versus inequality, employment opportunities, all of that is going to contribute to someone's overall mental health. So just a brief overview about mental ill health or mental illness in different cultures. What do we know? We know that some mental disorders, for example, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, they are found across all populations, regardless of race, religion, sex, ethnicity. So what that means is that there have been a lot of studies done, and they found that those kinds of mental disorders and a few others as well, they are found across all populations in the world. The difference is the way that they might manifest can be different from culture to culture, but it can still be the same disorder. So, for instance, in some cultures in Zimbabwe and China, people are more likely to experience somatic symptoms related to mental illness. What that means is someone might be experiencing some physical symptom that they can't explain, they can't really find the cause for that. And when they investigate a bit further, when the clinicians investigate a bit further, they determine that that is actually just an expression of a mental illness. So for instance, in China, we know that instead of experiencing very strong emotional responses to depression, a lot of people actually experience a lot of physical responses. So things like a lot of headaches, a lot of fatigue, and things like that. And then some mental disorders, they seem to be specific to certain cultures, which is very interesting. So it's what we call cultural syndromes. It used to be called cultural bound syndromes. And I won't have time to go into them today, but I do encourage you, I put some examples in there that you can note down, and you can have a look at the slides as well when we send it to you. It's very interesting because in some cultures, there are some very specific kinds of mental disorders as well. Now, stigma and discrimination. Firstly, what is stigma? So stigma is a cluster of negative attitudes and beliefs about mental illness. It's just beliefs that we hold about mental illness in general. And then there are two main types of stigma. The first one is social stigma. So social stigma is the fear, rejection, avoidance, and discrimination against people with mental illness. And the impact of social stigma is that family, friends, and acquaintances distance themselves from the person with mental ill health. And there is a lot of lower prospects in life. So someone with a mental illness, they have lower chances of getting good housing, good employment, and good relationships as well. And that is because of those very negative beliefs that in general as a society people may face regarding mental illness. And then the next one is self-stigma. So self-stigma, according to Say in Australia, I really like this definition, is something that happens when someone accepts and takes on the prejudiced perception held by others. So they start really believing in what is taught to them and in what, other people say about someone with mental illness. Even if that's not their reality, they start believing in that. And that is very, very problematic, because people affected with mental illness, if they have self-stigma, they start failing to seek proper mental health supports. They have poor self-image and self-efficacy, which just means that they start believing that they're not capable of dealing with the demands of life, and that they're not a worthy person, basically. They have a lot of fear of being seen unfavorably by family, friends, and society. So you can see that stigma is something that is very detrimental to someone's life overall and to the outcomes of someone in life. But also, people with mental illness, they usually, because stigma exists and because discrimination exists, it is actually very negative for someone's mental health, and it actually makes the condition worse. So is those kind of things that we need to address in ourselves and in the way that we talk about mental illness and the way that we see mental illness, really. And the best way to do that is by talking about it, is by understanding more and getting more educated about it, because then we won't really have a lot of reason to fear and we won't have reason to discriminate against people. So in the Australian society, I just put a few examples of stigma that we know of. So media influences is a big one. So for instance, schizophrenia was portrayed as linked to violence in 47% of Australian media articles in a period of 6 months. What that means is that people with schizophrenia, when we think about someone with schizophrenia, if we don't know anyone who has the condition and we just think about what we've seen in the media, we'll directly relate it to violence. The reality is that we know that people who have schizophrenia are much more likely to be victims than perpetrators of violence. And they're no more violent than the general population, which means someone who doesn't have a mental illness, they're no more violent than someone like that. So it's very unfair to be treating them this way. And we also had a look at a survey with Australians living with mental ill health. And this survey shows that 71% of people with mental illness, they are treated as less competent after revealing their mental illness to other people. Just over half of participants were advised to lower their expectations because of their mental illness. And 85% were worried other people would view them unfavorably because of their mental illness. So again, it's not the mental illness that is the problem here. It's actually the way that we as a society treat people, that it becomes very marginalizing for people. And I just put some studies here that were done in Nigeria, Tanzania, and some Arabic countries. There are some very stigmatizing beliefs about the causes of mental illness. So beliefs of mental illness being caused by evil spirit, witchcraft, demon possession, and divine punishment. And also some negative beliefs about people living with mental illness. So similar to in Australian society, beliefs that people are incapable of looking after themselves, they're dangerous, crazy, less intelligent, and incompetent. And also beliefs that mental illness is shameful, embarrassing, and it is incompatible with true friendships, marriage, or having children. So again, putting people experiencing a mental illness in a very difficult spot to actually live their life and have a fulfilling life, just because they're diagnosed with something. And in Nigeria, custodial care, which is basically locking someone up, is seen as the best approach to treatment. And this is a problem because, as I said before, we know from statistics from decades that people with mental illness are not more dangerous than the general population. But what we do when we lock people up is we limit their right to freedom, basically. Okay, so talked a little bit about stigma and about how mental illness is seen in different places in the world. Now, I just wanted to talk about some common mental ill health conditions. I'll be talking about the two most common ones, which are anxiety and depression, and about a third one as well. So when I talk about anxiety, I'll be talking about the most common symptoms in anxiety disorders in general. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into each kind, and each kind of anxiety disorder is a bit different to the other. But that's why I recommend maybe having a look online. There's some really good resources. But yeah, just some general symptoms that you can maybe start identifying yourself and in people that you know, that you work with. Can be tricky to identify that is anxiety sometimes. So it's good to know. So excessive worrying, irritability, muscle tension, difficulty concentrating and making decisions, and difficulty to fall and stay asleep. So you'll notice that there are a few physical symptoms there that we often don't talk about, but they're very, very common expressions of mental illness as well. So things like muscle tension, someone with anxiety, they'll often be very, very tense around the neck and around the body in general. And they have difficulty to fall and stay asleep as well. So very physical things. And yeah, then those are the symptoms as well. So anxiety is a healthy emotion as long as it's not prolonged. So what I mean by that is we all experience anxiety from time to time. That is normal, that is natural. And there's usually a reason for us to be experiencing anxiety, is either because we have, I don't know, a job interview, or because, you know, there's something that worries us and that makes us feel like, you know, it's a potential threat and we need to prepare for it. And that is the function of anxiety, is helping us to prepare for situations. But when it becomes out of control, when we feel anxious all the time, or in certain types of situations we feel anxious all the time, and we worry excessively, we lose sleep for weeks, things like that, then that needs to be looked at, because it's probably something else. It's not just the natural anxiety that we all feel. And then the next one is depression. So with depression, same thing. There are a lot of different depressive disorders, but I'll be just talking about some common symptoms shared among them. So loss of interest and pleasure in activities, fatigue, lack of energy, feeling worthless or excessively guilty, difficulty concentrating and making decisions again. So you can see how the two most common conditions in the world, which are anxiety and depression, they actually affect people's capacity to concentrate and to make decisions. Feeling sad, empty, numb most of the time, reduced motivation, and feeling irritated or angry. Frequent crying is a very common one in depression as well. And I think it's very important to have a look at some of the symptoms that maybe we're not too familiar with. So when we think about depression in general, and even the way that depression is portrayed in the media and things like that, is often related to frequent crying and to feeling sad all the time. And even though those are symptoms, there are many other symptoms that are very important. And someone with depression, sometimes they might not even cry, but they might just have complete loss of interesting things that they used to like to do before, complete loss of motivation, and then feeling very fatigued, so just tired all the time, things like that, and just feeling numb. That is an important one as well, because often people with depression, they might not even feel that sad, but they feel very numb. So they just feel like nothing brings them joy, or sometimes they have a few moments of joy, but it's very difficult overall to experience positive emotions. So again, with depression, if we all feel sad sometimes, there's usually a reason for that. We all experience all of those symptoms sometimes, but the problem becomes when we've been experiencing one or more of those symptoms for a prolonged time, so maybe 2 weeks in a row or something like that, then that becomes a concern, and it should be checked by a GP or someone, a professional in the area of mental health. Okay, the last one that I want to talk about is not as common as anxiety and depression, but it is very common, especially among people living with a disability or people coming from migrant backgrounds. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what some of the symptoms are. So post-traumatic stress disorder, the common symptoms are recurrent distressing memories or dreams about the traumatic event, feeling as though you are re-experiencing the traumatic event, so as if it's happening right now, reduced interest and participation in social activities, persistent negative emotional state, so experiencing emotions such as fear, anger, guilt, shame most of the time, exaggerated negative beliefs about self and others. So exaggerated negative beliefs about self and others is really a lack of trust in yourself and in others in the world. And what I really want to highlight is that for all those conditions, there is treatment available. There is some very effective treatment available, and there is help out there. So I know that sometimes people experiencing those conditions, they feel like this is it and it's going to be like this for the rest of their life, but it really doesn't have to be. So now that we've had a bit of an overview about the mental health conditions, the most common ones, and about stigma and discrimination, I want to talk to you about what we can do if we notice that we have been experiencing symptoms like that, or someone we know might have been experiencing that. And even if we haven't, we'll be talking about things that we can do to maintain good mental health, because we don't want just the absence of mental illness. We want to actually thrive in our life. And so it's very good to be doing those strategies that we'll be talking about now. So first and foremost, if you have a mental health condition, or if you've been experiencing symptoms like that, seek professional care. Professional care might include medication as well as psychological interventions, so things like counseling, as well as supported lifestyle changes. So we'll be talking about some lifestyle changes now, but sometimes just doing that by ourselves is not enough, and we need a bit of support and help from a professional to do that as well. Don't be afraid to learn about and understand your experience, because the more we understand, the better we can deal with it. And look after yourself, practice self-care. So I just put a cartoon here, which I thought was quite funny, which is the Guide to a Perfect Mental Health. And it talks about nutrition, a diet full of fresh vegetables, herbal tea, yoga, go outside, enjoy nature. And then one person asks the other, now that you are one with the universe and life itself, tell me your inner secrets you've learned. And then the person responds, I'm hella broke and I still have anxiety. And the meaning of this is that sometimes, as I said before, we can do all the self-care strategies and we can do all the techniques that we know of by ourselves, but sometimes we need a little extra help, and there is no shame in that. Okay, so how can I look after my mental health? I'll be talking about self-care now. And self-care, the way we often think about self-care is things like, doing a nice face mask and treating yourself to dinner and, things like that. So activities that really bring you pleasure in your life, that can be a part of a self-care routine, but it's not just that. So self-care is actually a lot broader than that. And it's really about understanding what your body needs, what your mind needs. It's really about tuning in with yourself to listen to your needs and to address those needs and make sure that you're fully nourished. There are different kinds of self-care. I'll be talking about a few of them today. This is in no way an exhaustive list, but it's something to get you started. So the first one that I want to talk about is physical self-care. And self-care doesn't necessarily have to feel good at the time or have to be something that you feel like doing at the time, but it's something that you know it's important for you to do. So I'll start with exercise. Exercise, we often don't feel like doing it. I know that I often don't feel like doing it, but I know that it is important for your physical health, obviously, but it's also very important for your mental health. So we now know that only 15 minutes a day of exercise, something that really makes your heart race, that is enough to release chemicals in your brain called endorphins. And what endorphins do is they help your mental health. So they lower symptoms of depression. Even if you don't have like a diagnosed depressive condition, they lower those negative emotions. They help with your sleep, they help you with your metabolism. So it's very positive for mental health overall. And it is actually being shown in people experiencing mild levels of depression to be as effective as antidepressants. So exercising at least 15 minutes a day, very, very important. It doesn't have to be something, I really wouldn't encourage you to do something that you hate. Try to find something that you love, and then it won't feel as much as a chore, like a chore. Spending time in nature. So we now know that spending time in nature has some very, very positive impacts on physical and mental health as well. You don't even have to be exercising in nature. Just the fact of spending time in nature is enough. So going to a park or something like that. I know that right now it's not the best moment to be doing that, but once we go back to normal and we can do those things again, it's very much encouraged to do so, because spending time in nature has been shown to help people with problem solving. So people get more creative and their ability to solve problems in their life improves. And that is just by spending time in nature. It also has been shown some physical health effects as well. So things like it actually lowers your blood pressure and it helps with anxiety too, and with lowering depressive symptoms. And the next one is very much related to that. So it's about increasing natural light in your environment and spending time outside. We now know that natural light, it's very, very important for our mental health. So even if you're at home, try to have the curtains open instead of having the lights on, because just having that natural light helps with sleep at night and also lower symptoms of depression. There have been studies showing that that is the case. And we know that there is a specific type of depression which only happens during winter time, when people don't really have a lot of exposure to the sun. That's called seasonal affective disorder. So yeah, very much recommended. Is something that is actually quite simple to do and has great benefits for mental health. Nutrition. Nutrition is a big one. So I actually put the cartoon there, the mental health fairy. Be sure to drink, I don't know if you can see that well. Be sure to drink plenty of water. And then the lady says, oh, but I already drink. And then the fairy says, more. Why? Because water, again, we know that it's very important for physical health, but it's actually very, very important for our mental health as well. When we are dehydrated, even if we're not feeling thirsty, if we don't have enough water, and by that I mean at least 8 cups of water every day, our body is going to distress. And when our bodies are stressed, they try to protect us. And funnily enough, when our bodies are stressed and trying to protect us, they worsen symptoms of mental illness, because there's alarm bells ringing and saying, okay, there's a dangerous situation, we're not getting enough water. and then mental health becomes very, very poor in that situation. Also avoiding, I think I put it there, avoiding alcohol and other drugs as well, or at least reducing the amount of alcohol and other drugs consumed. That includes coffee, includes caffeine. So these things, again, they change the way that our brains work, even if just momentarily. And that is not very good for mental health. So limiting the intake is the best approach. And for people really struggling with mental illness, it might be the case of just cutting those things out entirely. Now, we'll talk a bit about emotional self-care here. So physical self-care is done. Emotional self-care, I think, is something that we tend not to look at very often, unfortunately. And it is quite a bit of work, but it's totally worth it. So how can we start looking after our emotions and our emotional health, which is a big part of mental health? We can start by journaling and drawing our thoughts and feelings. So identifying unhelpful thoughts and replacing them with helpful ones. What I mean by that is the way that we think influences the way that we feel, and we know that. So if we're thinking, for instance, if I'm driving to work and I'm running a bit late and there's this person in front of me and they're just going way below the speed limit and there's no overtaking lane. If I start thinking, okay, I'm going to be late, and this person in front of me, why are they doing this? I mean, are they a stupid person, or what is the matter with them? Don't they know I'm going to be late, and my boss is going to be angry? And if I start having those thoughts, then it's very likely that I'll start feeling very angry and very agitated and very stressed. Whereas if in exactly the same situation, I think, okay, I'm running a bit late, I will have to explain it to my boss, but it's not the end of the world. No one's is going to die because I'm not there. And yeah, maybe next time I'll have to leave the house a bit earlier. Then that, I still might be feeling annoyed and frustrated with the situation, but I probably won't be feeling as angry. So I'm de-escalating my emotions just by the thoughts that I'm having. And that is something very good if you're having a very strong emotional response to something, or even if it's not very strong, but you're feeling something different, then try to write down and identify what's happening, what are your thoughts, and whether you can replace them with some more helpful ones. And that might help. It takes practice, but it helps in the end. Mindfulness meditation and grounding techniques. So there are ancient practices of mindfulness meditation, and there are now a lot of apps that you can just download to your cell phone or something like that. And there are guided videos on YouTube as well as some courses on that. Doing maybe 20 minutes of mindfulness meditation and grounding techniques has been shown by scientific studies to lower our levels of stress and anxiety, and to help us make better decisions in our lives. So it's very important for emotional self-care, and it's very important as well. It's related to the one that I'll talk about next. So I'll talk about them together. It's very important for us to engage in those practices, because it's really a time for us to sit down and just dedicate maybe 20 minutes all to ourselves, where we don't have to worry about the future. We don't have to keep thinking about everything that went wrong in the past. It's just being in the present moment and really learning to label our emotions. So what I mean by labeling our emotions is sometimes we just think of emotions in terms of happy, sad, and angry. But the reality is that the way we experience emotions is a lot more layered than that. So it's important to be able to identify that, and to be able to really sit with those emotions. And it's related to this one, which is about not holding on to emotions. So once we label emotion, for instance, angry, I feel angry right now. Okay, recognize that. That is okay. You are allowed to feel angry, and that's a valid emotion. Don't hold on to it. Don't try to extend it. Just let it come and let it pass. We have the tendency of holding on to emotions. So learning to not hold on to them is actually a process that we really have to work on, but it's very, very important to be emotionally healthy. So sometimes we might be in a moment where we're very happy, and we are doing something that we really enjoy, and we might think, oh, I don't want this feeling to go away, I don't want this feeling to pass. Or it might be the other way around. So it might be you feeling extremely devastated with something that happened, and you might think, okay, this is never going to pass. And the reality is, those thoughts, both of them, they are unhelpful, because emotions, they're meant to pass. That is what emotions do. They come, they serve their purpose, and they go away. So not holding on, knowing that every emotion is going to come and is going to go away, it's very helpful to start understanding the way that we feel and our behaviors that result from that, the way that we act in response to our emotions. When we start really tuning in with what we're feeling, with the emotions that we're having, then we can start seeing changes in our life and in the way that we behave even. And the last one is learning your triggers and having a plan for when you become unwell. So this one is probably more relevant to people who are currently struggling with mental illness than for someone who's just trying to learn ways to maintain emotional health. If someone is struggling with mental illness, then it's very important for them to know what makes them worse, and to be able to identify that and have it in a plan, like an actual physical plan, where they can write it down and they can share it with people that they trust. And then having a plan of, okay, what to do. So if I'm feeling this way, so for instance, if you know that talking to a certain person always makes you feel worse in your mental health and extremely anxious and angry, then you might need a plan if you need to talk to that person. So what is the plan going to be? What are you going to do in terms of your emotional self-care before talking to that person and after? And even during, how can you regulate your emotions during that? And how can other people assist you? Is there a support person that can come with you, that can help you to deal with that situation? So this is obviously just one example, but it's important to know our triggers and to know the things that make us worse in our mental health, and then what to do, what we can do, as well as what other people can do to support us. And then the other one that I really want to talk about is social self-care. So social self-care is about really remembering that we are social animals and we need social support. And I know that at this time, many of us are in social isolation. We don't really have the opportunity to be seeing a lot of people, but it's very important to maintain that social connection in any way that we can, be it by telephone or face-to-face. Even messaging is fine. So making social connections and asking and accepting help. That is how we've evolved and survived as human beings, is by making connections and really helping others and accepting help. And so we need to continue to do that. It's important for our mental health to have that social support. And you'll remember that when we started this presentation, I talked about this as well, about how much more vulnerable someone who doesn't have social supports is to mental illness than someone who has good social supports in place. And establishing healthy boundaries. So again, that goes back to really knowing yourself really well, really knowing what your boundaries are, what you're willing to accept and what you're not willing to accept. This will be different for everyone. So it's really important for you to really know yourself and really pay attention to how you feel in certain situations. So again, I'll just give you a random example. You might not want to answer any phone calls after 9 p.m. But for some people, some friends and family, they'll always call you at 10 p.m. And you feel like you have to answer that call because you care about them and you love them and you don't want to reject the call. So establishing healthy boundaries is really understanding what is good and what isn't good for you, and then communicating that to people. The best way to do that is through what we call assertive communication. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into it today, but I really highly recommend that you have a look at assertive communication on the internet. There's some really good resources, some videos explaining how to do it, and you can practice the best way to communicate with people. Basically, what assertive communication is communicating things to people in a way that is respectful, in a way that shows your needs, but is also attentive to the other person's needs. And so in this example that I gave you, it might be that you use assertive communication to say, okay, I understand that you like to talk to me and I'm very happy for that. Is it possible to have a phone chat at another time? Because this is a time that I usually need some time for myself and I don't want to be talking at that time. So things like that, really establishing boundaries that are going to help you keep a good mental health. Because the thing with self-care is that we often spend a lot of time caring for others and we forget to look within and we forget to look for what we need. And the problem when that happens is that we become, we kind of lose touch with ourselves and with our identity and things like that. And that is not good. Last one I want to talk about is intellectual and spiritual self-care. I've combined them, but there are two separate types of self-care. So taking time out for hobbies, identifying things that you enjoy doing, that you just do for pleasure and you just do for yourself. So it will be different for everyone, but it could be a sport that you really like to play. It could be some arts and crafts that you like to make, or cooking. Anything that gives you pleasure and that gives you a sense of accomplishment is very important to stimulate your brain and to keep you healthy in that aspect. Stimulating your brain with things like reading or solving puzzles or listening to an engaging podcast on a subject that you like. Again, very important for intellectual self-care. So looking at that side of our intellectual beings, really. And then in terms of spiritual self-care, making time for spiritual and cultural practices. So cultural practices, they help us to feel a sense of belonging, and that is extremely important for us, and it's very difficult to have good mental health if you're disconnected from that in some way. And spiritual, it will be having a religion for some people. It will be connecting to nature for other people. It could look very differently for different people. But the main thing is being connected to something that gives you a sense of a bigger meaning in life than, just living. So that is it for today. That is all we have time for. If you're feeling distressed or experiencing low mood, or if there's something that I talked about today that triggered something for you, here are some helplines that you can contact. And there's some others online as well if you have a look. There's plenty of resources. You'll notice that I put Beyond Blue there. They have a telephone and online chat support, but they also have a lot of good resources, especially on anxiety and depression, on their website. So if you're interested to learn more, that is a very good place to start. Thank you very much. And now feel free to ask any questions that you might have. I will stop the share screen now.
Sorry, I don't have any questions really. Everything was discussed very well. Just need to ask one thing, that all the material that we have just discussed, can we get it online? Can you post it to us or something like that?
Do you mean the
So I can answer. Sorry.
No,
I can
for it.
say that I've set up a Dropbox for everybody who's involved in accessing these presentations and such. So you should have received an email that has a link to the Dropbox. So just go through your email. It could have gone into junk or spam, so check those files. If you haven't received any of that, then just give me an email back and I'll try to resend it to you. But everything will be in that Dropbox. So the PowerPoint presentations, the recordings, and any additional resources on the topics too will be there.
Yeah. So we will get it after you will finish with all the 4 sessions, and we will complete the sessions on Thursday. Yeah. After that, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, because while you were showing all these things, I was just sometimes taking photos of it.
Yeah, should probably have mentioned it at the start. Sorry,
can I just ask, do you need to have a Dropbox app or you just open the link?
you're muted, Elisa.
So you should just be able to open the link that I send via the email.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can I just ask one question about cognitive bases or biases?
Yeah. Biases,
Can
yeah.
you elaborate on that a bit further, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So cognitive biases, basically what they are is something that we all have. So they're like shortcuts that we have when we're making a judgment about something, or when we're making a decision or coming to a conclusion. Because often in life, we don't have time to go through a very thorough process of decision making or of making judgments. So we have something that is called cognitive biases. There are a lot of different types of cognitive biases. And I can send Alisa some further information on that, and we can add it to the Dropbox as well. But let me think of an example to give you. So one example of a cognitive bias is actually stereotyping. So stereotyping is something that happens when we make a very quick judgment about something or someone based on the main characteristics that we've heard about that. So it could be, for instance, if we talk about, so I'm Brazilian, so I'll give you an example about stereotyping for Brazil. So whenever I say I'm Brazilian, people start asking me about soccer. And I really don't like soccer, but it's a stereotype. So it's that very quick judgment when we don't know a lot about something. We make a very quick judgment based on the information that we have. And then there are ways to kind of overcome those cognitive biases, which is usually sitting down and thinking about it with more time and detail and learning about it, educating yourselves. So stereotyping is an example, but it can be other things as well. So it can be, there is a very interesting one, which is called the availability heuristic. So that is a type of cognitive bias where we, for instance, let's say the last month that I was still going to the office for work, I saw maybe a lot of highway patrol police cars when I was going in my commuting on the way to the office and back, right? So with that, I might decide that the number of highway patrols has increased in Victoria. But I actually don't have that information. That is just based on what I saw. So it's based on what's available in my knowledge. So it's what's available, I take that as, you know, a reality when it doesn't necessarily is. So those kind of things are cognitive biases. It's basically really shortcuts that we take. And it's okay, like it's important for our survivor to have those cognitive biases, because like if you need to run from a tiger, you can't really be taking a lot of time to make a decision. So we need those quick decision-making skills, but it can be in other ways. Yep.
Okay, so it's not like internal dialogue, your own internal dialogue. Is that's not cognitive biases? Like if you do something wrong and it's like, I'm stupid, why did I do that? that doesn't, that's
No,
not
that
the
wouldn't
term
be a
here.
cognitive bias. That would be
Okay.
what we call, I'm trying to remember, it's cognitive something. Yeah, I can't remember the exact term for it, but it's not a cognitive bias. So that is like a cognitive error kind of thing. But it's this is not the right term. I can have a look and send it to you because I don't remember at the moment. Yeah, but it's not a cognitive bias. No worries. But internal dialogues definitely will influence our mental health as well. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a very informative talk. Well done.
I'm glad you enjoyed
Thanks
it.
a lot.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
No.
Good.
All right, great.
Thank
Well,
you.
look forward to tomorrow's talk.
It will be on the same time, I think, 10:30.
Yes. So tomorrow we will have Dolly talking about the My Aged Care system, and it will start at 10:30 and go until 11:30, the same as this morning.
Yeah. Okay.
Lovely.
Thanks.
All right.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks, Aisha, for today. It's very informative.
Thank you.
Thanks, ladies.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.